I never thought someone would threaten me over propane tanks, but that was before I met Brenda Patterson, the newly elected president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was a scorching Tuesday afternoon in late June when I first heard the sharp knock on my front door. I had just gotten home from my job as an electrical contractor and was looking forward to grilling some steaks on my back patio. The temperature was pushing 108 degrees, typical for Arizona summers, and all I wanted was a cold beer and some time to myself. When I opened the door, I found myself face to face with a woman in her mid-50s wearing a pristine white visor, designer sunglasses pushed up on her head, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like it was the Declaration of Independence. Her blonde hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, and her lips were pressed into a thin line that screamed displeasure. "Ryan Edwards?" she asked, though it sounded more like an accusation than a question. "That's me," I replied, leaning against the doorframe. "Can I help you? I'm Brenda Patterson, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I need to discuss a serious violation I observed on your property." I raised an eyebrow. I had lived in this house for 3 years and had never had a single issue with the HOA. I kept my lawn maintained, my house painted in approved colors, and generally kept to myself. "What violation?" Brenda's eyes narrowed behind her glasses. "You have 3 propane tanks visible on the side of your house. According to Section 12.7 of the HOA bylaws, all utility equipment must be screened from view of neighboring properties." I sighed, already feeling the headache forming behind my eyes. The propane tanks in question were for my generator, my grill, and a backup heater I used during the rare cold snaps Arizona experienced in winter. They were neatly arranged against the side wall of my house, in an area I thought was reasonably discreet. "I wasn't aware that was an issue," I said carefully. "I can look into building a screen or something to hide them." "That would be acceptable," Brenda said, making a note on her clipboard. Then she looked up at me with an expression that made my stomach drop. "However, I also noticed you have quite the stockpile there. 4 20-pound tanks and 2 larger ones if I counted correctly." Actually, she had counted correctly, which meant she had been snooping pretty thoroughly around my property. "I like to keep backups. We get power outages during monsoon season, and I use my generator to keep my refrigerator and AC running." "Yes, well, here's the thing." Brenda's voice took on a tone that was trying to sound reasonable but came across as condescending. "The HOA is planning a community event next month. A 4th of July barbecue for all residents. We're going to need propane for the grills, and since you have such an abundance, it only makes sense that you contribute to the community." I blinked at her, not quite processing what she was suggesting. "You want me to give you my propane tanks?" "Not all of them, of course," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "Just 3 or 4 of them. You clearly have more than you need, and this is about community spirit, Ryan. Being part of an HOA means contributing to the greater good." "Those tanks aren't free," I said, feeling my jaw tighten. "I paid for them. They're my property." Brenda's smile became strained. "I understand that, but you're also in violation of HOA rules by having them visible. I'm offering you a way to remedy the situation and help your community at the same time. Consider it a goodwill gesture." The audacity of her statement left me momentarily speechless. She was essentially trying to blackmail me into giving her my property by using the violation as leverage. "Let me get this straight. You're saying if I don't give you my propane tanks for free, you'll pursue the violation?" "I'm saying that community-minded residents typically find ways to contribute," Brenda replied, her voice taking on a harder edge. Those who don't tend to find themselves under increased scrutiny. I'm sure you understand. I felt the anger rising in my chest, but forced myself to stay calm. I'll build a screen for the tanks within the next 2 weeks, but I'm not giving you my property. If the HOA needs propane for an event, you can budget for it like any other expense. Brenda's face flushed red, and her knuckles went white around her clipboard. That's your final answer? That's my answer, I confirmed. Fine, she snapped. But don't say I didn't give you the opportunity to do this the easy way. You have 14 days to remedy the violation or you'll start receiving fines, $50 per day. She turned on her heel and marched back to her car, a white BMW SUV that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. I watched her drive away, feeling the knot in my stomach tightening. Something told me this was far from over. I called my neighbor, Marcus, a retired lawyer who had lived in Meadowbrook Estates since the development was built 10 years ago. He came over that evening with a copy of the HOA bylaws and covenants, and we sat at my kitchen table going through them. You're technically in violation, Marcus admitted, pointing to the relevant section. But the enforcement has always been pretty lenient. Most people have their garbage cans visible at some point, air conditioning units, pool equipment. The rule exists mainly to prevent people from turning their yards into junkyards. So what's her angle? I asked, nursing my second beer of the evening. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his weathered face thoughtful. Brenda got elected president 3 months ago on a platform of restoring property values and enforcing standards. Between you and me, I think she's on a power trip. She's sent violation notices to half the neighborhood for the most trivial things. Mrs. Chen got one because her mailbox was the wrong shade of black. The Rodriguezes got cited because their lawn was a 1/4 inch too tall. So she's just looking for things to complain about. Worse than that, Marcus said grimly. I think she's trying to build up the HOA fund by collecting fines. She's proposed some expensive projects, including renovating the community center and installing a new fountain at the entrance. The problem is, most residents voted against the special assessment to pay for it, so now she's finding other ways to generate revenue. That's insane, I muttered. Welcome to HOA politics, Marcus replied with a dry laugh. My advice: build your screen, document everything, and don't engage with her more than necessary. People like Brenda thrive on conflict. I took Marcus's advice to heart. That weekend, I drove to Home Depot and bought materials to build a simple lattice screen. It wasn't elaborate, just some wooden posts and lattice panels that would block the view of the tanks from the street and neighboring properties. It took me most of Saturday to install, but by Sunday afternoon, I had a decent-looking screen that fully complied with the HOA rules. I took photos from multiple angles, time-stamped them, and emailed them to the HOA's official email address with a polite message explaining that the violation had been remedied. I felt satisfied that I had handled the situation professionally and efficiently. That satisfaction lasted exactly 4 days. On Thursday evening, I came home to find an official letter from the HOA tucked into my door. Inside was a notice stating that my lattice screen was not in compliance with Section 14.3 of the Architectural Guidelines, which required all structures to be approved by the Architectural Review Committee before installation. There was a fine of $250 attached, and I had 7 days to either remove the screen or submit it for review. I read the letter 3 times, each time feeling my blood pressure rising. The Architectural Review Committee consisted of 3 people, one of whom was Brenda herself. I had walked right into a trap. If I removed the screen, I would be back in violation of the first rule. If I left it up, I would be in violation of the second rule. Either way, I was facing fines. I immediately called Marcus, who came over and read the letter with an increasingly grim expression. "This is retaliation," he said flatly. "She's targeting you because you refused to give her the propane tanks." "Can she do this?" I asked. "Technically, yes. The architectural review rule is legitimate. Most people just don't know about it because it's buried deep in the covenants, and historically it's only been enforced for major changes like adding rooms or changing roof colors. But it's there, and she can use it." "So what do I do?" Marcus thought for a moment. "Submit the screen for review. Make it official. Document everything, keep copies of all correspondence, and don't pay any fines until you've exhausted all your options. If this goes to court, you want to show that you made good faith efforts to comply." I spent that evening filling out the architectural review application, which was a 6-page document asking for everything from the dimensions of the structure to the specific species of wood used. I attached my photos, included a site plan showing exactly where the screen was located, and submitted it online through the HOA portal. The response came faster than I expected. The next morning, I received an email from Brenda directly, not through the official HOA email. The subject line read, "Your application denied." The email was brief and to the point. My application had been reviewed by the architectural committee and denied on the grounds that lattice screens were not aesthetically consistent with the desert contemporary style of Meadowbrook Estates. The email suggested I consider a stucco wall instead, which would require professional installation and likely cost several $1,000s. At the bottom of the email, almost as an afterthought, Brenda had added, "Of course, if you're struggling financially, the HOA would be willing to waive these requirements in exchange for community contributions. I believe we discussed this previously." There it was. She was still trying to shake me down for the propane tanks. I forwarded the email to Marcus and then sat back, trying to decide my next move. The lawyer in Marcus came out in his response. He suggested I request a formal hearing with the HOA board, which was my right under Arizona law. Every homeowner had the right to appear before the board to dispute violations and decisions before fines could be legally enforced. I submitted my request that afternoon, citing the specific statute in Arizona's Planned Communities law. Within 2 hours, I received a response scheduling a hearing for the following Wednesday at 7 in the evening at the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. I continued to receive daily violation notices, each one threatening increasing fines. The amounts were adding up on paper. $50 per day for the visible propane tanks, $50 per day for the unapproved structure, plus the initial $250 fine. According to Brenda's calculations, I now owed over $1,000. I didn't pay a cent. Instead, I spent my evenings researching Arizona HOA law, reading through case precedents, and preparing my argument. Marcus helped me organize my evidence and coached me on how to present my case. He also warned me that Brenda would likely have stacked the board with her supporters. Wednesday arrived, and I dressed in business casual attire, bringing a folder full of documents, photos, and printed emails. Marcus came with me for moral support, though he couldn't officially represent me at an HOA hearing. The community center was a modest building near the entrance of the development, with a meeting room that could hold maybe 30 people. When I arrived, I found about a dozen residents already seated, most of whom I recognized from around the neighborhood. The HOA board sat at a table at the front, Brenda in the center, flanked by 2 other board members I had never met, Brenda's expression when she saw me was cold and professional, but I could see the satisfaction in her eyes. She thought she had me cornered. "This hearing will come to order," Brenda announced, rapping a gavel on the table. "We're here to address violations by Mr. Ryan Edwards of 4782 Sagaro Lane regarding visible utility equipment and an unapproved structure. Mr. Edwards, you have 15 minutes to present your case." I stood and walked to the front of the room, acutely aware of everyone's eyes on me. I took a breath and began. "Thank you for allowing me to speak. 3 weeks ago, Mrs. Patterson came to my home and informed me that my propane tanks were in violation of HOA rules. I immediately took steps to remedy this by building a screen, which I completed within 1 week. I then received a notice that the screen itself was in violation because I hadn't obtained prior approval. I submitted an application for approval, which was denied within 24 hours. I held up the printed emails. The denial suggested I build a stucco wall instead, which would cost thousands of dollars for a violation I was trying to correct in good faith. I believe this is unreasonable and represents selective enforcement of HOA rules. One of the other board members, a thin man in his 60s, spoke up. "The architectural review process exists to maintain property values. Surely you understand that." "I do understand that," I replied. "But I question why a simple lattice screen, which is common throughout this neighborhood, is suddenly unacceptable. I've documented at least 7 other properties within Meadowbrook Estates that have similar screens for various purposes. None of them have been cited for violations." I pulled out photos I had taken over the past few days, showing other homes with lattice screens around air conditioning units, pool equipment, and even trash cans. I passed them to the board members. Brenda's face tightened as she looked through the photos. "Those structures may have been approved before installation." "Were they?" I challenged. "Because I checked the public records of architectural approvals for the past 5 years. None of these addresses appear in those records." There was a murmur from the residents in attendance. I saw a few people nodding, and Marcus gave me an encouraging look. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have evidence that this enforcement is retaliatory in nature. Mrs. Patterson initially came to my home not just to cite the violation, but to demand that I donate my personal property to the HOA for free. Specifically, she wanted me to give the HOA several of my propane tanks for a community event. When I refused, she threatened increased scrutiny. I have witnesses who can verify this." Brenda's face went from tight to bright red. "That's absolutely false. I never demanded anything. I merely suggested that a community-minded resident might want to contribute." "You told me that those who don't contribute tend to find themselves under increased scrutiny," I said, keeping my voice level. "That sounds like a threat to me." The third board member, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair, looked troubled. "Brenda, is this true?" "Of course not," Brenda snapped. "Mr. Edwards is twisting my words because he doesn't want to pay his fines. This is a classic case of a resident trying to avoid responsibility for violations." "Then explain why I'm being held to a different standard than other residents," I said. "Explain why my application was denied in 24 hours when the bylaws state that architectural reviews are supposed to take 7 to 14 business days. Explain why you suggested I could have the requirements waived in exchange for community contributions." I pulled out my phone and opened my email. "Actually, I have that in writing. You sent me an email last week that said, and I quote, 'If you're struggling financially, the HOA would be willing to waive these requirements in exchange for community contributions.' I believe we discussed this previously." I showed the email to the board members. The gray-haired woman read it carefully, her frown deepening. "Brenda, this does look problematic. It's being taken out of context," Brenda insisted, but her voice had lost some of its confidence. I was trying to be flexible and find a solution. "A solution that involved me giving you my property for free," I said. "That's not flexibility, that's coercion." The room erupted in conversation, with several residents speaking up about their own experiences with Brenda's enforcement. Mrs. Chen stood and talked about her mailbox citation. Mr. Rodriguez mentioned the lawn height violation that had cost him $200 in fines. A younger couple near the back described being cited for having a small decorative fountain that was supposedly too loud, even though multiple neighbors had written letters saying they never heard it. Brenda tried to regain control by banging her gavel, but the damage was done. The gray-haired board member, who introduced herself as Susan Martinez, called for a recess so the board could discuss the matter privately. Marcus and I stepped outside into the warm evening air. "You did great," he said. "You got her to admit the email was real and you showed the selective enforcement. That's huge." "Do you think they'll drop the fines?" I asked. "I think they don't have a choice. If they uphold this, you have grounds for a lawsuit." Selective enforcement and retaliation are both valid legal claims against an HOA. We waited for 20 minutes before being called back inside. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Brenda looked furious, sitting with her arms crossed and her jaw clenched. Susan spoke for the board. "After reviewing the evidence and discussing the matter, the board has decided to waive all current fines against Mr. Edwards. Your lattice screen is approved retroactively, and we consider the violation remedied. We apologize for any confusion in the process." Relief washed over me, but I could see Brenda seething. "However," Susan continued, "we want to remind all residents that proper procedures should be followed for any exterior modifications. Going forward, please submit applications before beginning work." "I understand," I said. "Thank you for your time and for reviewing the evidence fairly." The hearing was adjourned, and as people began to leave, several residents came up to shake my hand and thank me. Apparently, Brenda had made enemies throughout the neighborhood, and people were glad to see someone stand up to her. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, on Friday evening, I was in my garage working on some electrical repairs for a client's project when I heard raised voices outside. I walked to my driveway and found Brenda standing next to my propane tanks, which were now properly screened, taking photos with her phone. "What are you doing?" I asked, immediately on guard. Brenda jumped, clearly not expecting me to be home. "I'm conducting a routine inspection," she said, recovering quickly. "It's within the HOA's rights to ensure compliance with safety regulations." "Safety regulations," I repeated. "Those tanks are stored according to the manufacturer's specifications and local fire codes." "We'll see about that," Brenda muttered, taking more photos. "I've filed a complaint with the Scottsdale Fire Department. They'll be out to inspect within the next week." She walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing in my driveway wondering what fresh hell she was trying to unleash. I called Marcus immediately and explained the situation. "She's escalating," Marcus said, concern evident in his voice. "This is harassment, Ryan. You might want to consider filing a formal complaint with the HOA board or even getting a lawyer involved." I didn't want to spend money on a lawyer if I could avoid it, but I started documenting everything meticulously. I took photos of my propane storage setup, printed out the manufacturer's safety guidelines, and researched local fire codes to make sure I was in compliance. The fire inspector showed up the following Tuesday. His name was Mike Chen, a serious-looking man in his 40s who arrived in an official Scottsdale Fire Department vehicle. I met him in my driveway and explained the situation. Someone filed a complaint about propane storage. He asked, pulling out a tablet. "Let me take a look." I showed him the tanks, explaining what each one was for and how I maintained them. Inspector Chen checked the connections, measured the distance from the tanks to the house, and examined the ventilation around the storage area. After about 15 minutes, he made some notes on his tablet and turned to me. "Everything looks good here," he said. "You're well within code. The tanks are properly secured, adequately ventilated, and at a safe distance from ignition sources. Whoever filed this complaint wasted everyone's time." "Can I get that in writing?" I asked. Inspector Chen raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Sure. I'll email you a copy of my inspection report. Should have it to you by tomorrow." True to his word, the report arrived in my inbox the next morning. I forwarded it to the HOA email address, with a polite note stating that the fire inspection had found no violations or safety concerns. I also sent a copy to Marcus for my records. I hoped that would finally end the harassment, but Brenda wasn't done. Over the next 3 weeks, I received a series of increasingly petty violation notices. My house number wasn't clearly visible from the street, despite being the same as it had been for 3 years. My mailbox post needed repainting. My front walkway had a crack that needed repair. Each notice came with threats of fines if not remedied within unreasonable timeframes. I fixed each issue as it came up, documenting everything with photos and receipts. But the constant harassment was wearing on me. I couldn't relax in my own home, constantly worried about what Brenda would find to complain about next. My work was suffering because I was distracted and stressed. Something had to give. The breaking point came in late July. I had left for a job site early one morning, planning to be gone most of the day installing electrical panels in a new commercial building. When I returned home around 6 in the evening, I immediately noticed something was wrong. The side gate to my backyard was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I always kept that gate locked. Always. My heart racing, I approached cautiously and found the lock had been cut. Someone had used bolt cutters to break into my backyard. I pulled out my phone and called 911, then waited by my truck until the police arrived. 2 officers responded, a veteran named Officer Rodriguez and a younger officer named Patterson, no relation to Brenda, thankfully. I explained the situation, showing them the cut lock and the open gate. We walked through my backyard together, and that's when I discovered what was missing. All 6 of my propane tanks were gone. The ones that had been securely stored behind my new lattice screen had been taken. The only thing left was the empty space where they had been, and some scuff, marks in the dirt. "Any idea who might have done this?" Officer Rodriguez asked, taking notes. "I have a pretty good idea," I said, and explained the entire situation with Brenda and the HOA. I showed them the emails, the violation notices, and the timeline of harassment. She initially wanted me to give her these tanks for free. When I refused, she's been targeting me with bogus violations for over a month. "That's a serious accusation," Officer Patterson said carefully. "Do you have any proof she actually took them?" "Not direct proof," I admitted, "but I have security cameras on my house. Let me check the footage." We went inside, and I pulled up the footage from my home security system on my computer. I had 4 cameras covering different angles of my property, including one that had a partial view of the side yard where the tanks had been stored. We watched the footage from earlier that day, fast-forwarding through the morning hours. At around 10:30 in the morning, a white BMW SUV pulled up in front of my house. My stomach sank as I recognized Brenda's vehicle. She got out, looked around, and then walked directly to my side gate. The angle wasn't perfect, but we could clearly see her examining the lock. She spent several minutes apparently trying to open it before returning to her SUV. A few minutes later, a white pickup truck pulled up behind her car. A man in his 20s got out, tall and muscular with short brown hair. "That might be her son," Officer Rodriguez said, leaning closer to the screen. "Tyler Patterson. We've had some dealings with him before." We watched as Brenda pointed to my gate and had what appeared to be an animated conversation with Tyler. He went to his truck and retrieved something, we couldn't see exactly what, and approached my gate. Within seconds, the lock was cut and the gate swung open. For the next 15 minutes, Tyler made multiple trips from my backyard to his truck, clearly carrying the propane tanks. Brenda stood watch by the vehicles, looking up and down the street. When all the tanks were loaded, they both got in their respective vehicles and drove away. "Well," Officer Rodriguez said, straightening up, "that's pretty damning evidence. That's burglary, criminal damage, and theft. The value of 6 propane tanks, even used ones, is going to put this into felony territory." "What happens now?" I asked, still trying to process what I had just watched. "We're going to need a copy of that footage," Officer Patterson said, "and we'll be paying Mrs. Patterson a visit." "Do you have receipts for the tanks? We'll need to establish value." I provided everything they needed. The officers took my statement, gave me a case number, and said a detective would likely be in touch within a day or two. After they left, I sat in my living room feeling violated and angry. Brenda had actually committed a crime, sent her son to break into my property, all because I wouldn't give her free propane. Marcus came over when I called him, and we watched the security footage again. "She's done," he said flatly. "This is criminal. The HOA board is going to have to remove her, and she's going to face charges. You need to make sure you cooperate fully with the police investigation." The next morning, Detective Sarah Mitchell called me. She was with the Scottsdale Police Department's Property Crimes Unit and wanted to get a formal statement. I met her at the police station, where I spent 2 hours going through everything in detail. She was thorough and professional, taking notes and asking clarifying questions. "We've already spoken with Mrs. Patterson," Detective Mitchell told me. "She denies taking the tanks and claims she was just conducting an HOA inspection of your property." "An inspection that required cutting my lock and removing my property?" I asked incredulously. "Her story has some holes," Detective Mitchell said with a slight smile. "Don't worry. We're building a solid case. The video evidence is clear, and we're getting a warrant to search her property and her son's truck. If those tanks are there, and I suspect they will be, we'll have everything we need." 2 days later, Detective Mitchell called to tell me they had executed the search warrant. All 6 of my propane tanks had been found in Brenda's garage, still in a pile where they had apparently been stored after being taken from my property. Tyler Patterson had also been arrested when they found bolt cutters in his truck that matched the cut marks on my lock. Both Brenda and Tyler were charged with burglary, theft, and criminal damage. Because the total value of the tanks plus the lock and my time and stress exceeded $1,000, these were felony charges. They were both released on bond pending trial, but the damage to Brenda's reputation was immediate and catastrophic. The HOA board held an emergency meeting 2 days after the arrests. Susan Martinez called me personally to apologize on behalf of the board and to inform me that Brenda had been removed from her position as president, effective immediately. The board also voted to reimburse me for my damaged lock and any other expenses related to the incident. The story spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire. Neighbors I had never spoken to stopped by to express their support. Several people mentioned that they were glad someone had finally stood up to Brenda's bullying tactics. The community Facebook page was filled with discussions about HOA reform and better oversight of board members. My propane tanks were returned to me by the police after being processed as evidence. I installed a heavier-duty lock on my gate and added an additional security camera with a better angle of the side yard. I wasn't taking any chances. The criminal case moved slowly through the court system, as these things do. Tyler Patterson, apparently not wanting to face trial, took a plea deal in September. He pleaded guilty to reduced charges of theft and criminal trespass, receiving probation and community service. He also had to write me a formal apology letter and pay restitution for the lock and my time away from work to deal with the incident. Brenda, however, refused to take a plea deal. She maintained her innocence, claiming the video was somehow doctored or taken out of context. Her lawyer tried various motions to suppress evidence or get the charges dismissed, but none of them succeeded. The case was scheduled for trial in November. During this time, life in Meadowbrook Estates slowly returned to normal. The HOA board appointed a new president, a retired accountant named David Morrison, who seemed genuinely interested in fair and reasonable enforcement of the rules. He reached out to all the residents who had been previously cited by Brenda and offered to review their violations. Several were dismissed as unreasonable or based on selective enforcement. I testified at Brenda's trial in late November. The courthouse in downtown Phoenix was busy and imposing, but I felt prepared. I had been through my testimony multiple times with the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh who specialized in property crimes. Taking the stand was nerve-wracking, but I told my story clearly and honestly. I described Brenda's initial visit, her demand for the propane tanks, the subsequent harassment, and finally the theft. The defense attorney tried to suggest I had somehow entrapped Brenda or provoked her actions, but the video evidence and timeline of events spoke for themselves. The trial lasted 3 days. In addition to my testimony, the prosecutor called Officer Rodriguez, Detective Mitchell, and several other Meadowbrook Estates residents who testified about Brenda's pattern of harassment and abuse of power. The security video was played for the jury multiple times, and Tyler Patterson was called as a witness, confirming that his mother had asked him to help her retrieve the tanks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. Brenda's face went pale when the verdict was read, and I saw her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder as she seemed to sway in her seat. Sentencing came 2 weeks later, just before Christmas. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Helen Vasquez, had clearly read through all the evidence and was not sympathetic to Brenda's position. She noted that Brenda had abused a position of trust within the community and had engaged in a pattern of harassment before committing the crimes. Brenda was sentenced to 18 months in prison, with the possibility of parole after 9 months. She was also ordered to pay full restitution, including the value of the propane tanks, my legal expenses, the new lock, and compensation for my time. The total came to just over $4,000. Additionally, she received 5 years of probation following her release and was prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position during that time. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a strange mix of emotions. I was relieved that justice had been served, but I also felt a bit sad that things had escalated to this point. If Brenda had just accepted my initial refusal and moved on, none of this would have happened. Her obsession with controlling others and punishing those who didn't comply with her demands had destroyed her life. Marcus met me for coffee after the sentencing, and we sat in a quiet cafe reflecting on the whole ordeal. "You know," he said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, "this whole situation is a perfect example of what happens when people get a little bit of power and let it go to their heads. HOAs can be useful organizations, but they attract certain personality types who just want to control their neighbors." "I'm just glad it's over," I said. "I can finally relax in my own home again." "You did the right thing," Marcus assured me. "You stood up for yourself, documented everything, and let the legal system work. A lot of people would have just given in or moved away." Christmas that year was peaceful. I hosted a small dinner for Marcus and a few other neighbors who had supported me through the ordeal. We grilled steaks on my patio, using propane from the very tanks that had caused all the trouble, and toasted to community, justice, and standing up against bullies. The new year brought changes to Meadowbrook Estates. David Morrison proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on actual community improvements rather than nitpicking violations. He organized volunteer workdays to maintain common areas, started a neighborhood watch program, and created a more transparent process for architectural reviews. The community felt friendlier and more cohesive than it had in years. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that Brenda's husband had filed for divorce while she was in prison. Her son Tyler had apparently moved to Nevada to start over somewhere people didn't know about his criminal record. The Patterson house sat empty for several months before finally being sold in March. A young family with 2 kids moved in, the Hendersons, and they quickly became popular in the neighborhood. Their kids played in the yard, and they were always friendly when walking their dog past my house. It was a marked improvement over the previous occupant. As spring arrived in Arizona, bringing those perfect sunny days before the brutal summer heat returned, I found myself reflecting on how much had changed in less than a year. I had gone from a quiet, private person who just wanted to be left alone to someone who had stood up against corruption and harassment in his own neighborhood. I had learned about HOA law, the criminal justice system, and the importance of documenting everything. Most importantly, I had learned that sometimes you have to fight for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable or scary. If I had just given Brenda those propane tanks that first day, I might have avoided the immediate conflict, but I would have established myself as someone who could be pushed around. The next demand would have come, and the next, until I was either broke or forced to move. My work as an electrical contractor kept me busy through the spring. I picked up several new clients and was building a good reputation in the Scottsdale area. The stress of the previous year had faded, replaced by a sense of peace and security in my home. My propane tanks sat securely behind their lattice screen, fueling my generator during spring storms and my grill during weekend barbecues. In May, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Brenda, forwarded through her lawyer since inmates couldn't send mail directly. The letter was brief and formal, nothing like the aggressive, demanding woman I had dealt with before. She apologized for her actions, acknowledged that she had let her position go to her head, and expressed hope that I could someday forgive her. She mentioned that prison had given her time to reflect on her behavior, and that she was working with a therapist to understand why she had acted the way she did. I read the letter twice, trying to gauge its sincerity. It was impossible to know if this was genuine remorse or just something her lawyer had advised her to write. Ultimately, I decided it didn't matter. I wrote a brief response acknowledging her apology and wishing her well in her rehabilitation. I had no interest in holding on to anger or resentment. The situation had been resolved, justice had been served, and I was ready to move forward. Summer returned to Arizona with its usual intensity. Temperatures soared above 110 degrees, and everyone retreated indoors during the hottest parts of the day. My generator got its usual workout during monsoon season, when powerful thunderstorms would roll through in the late afternoons, bringing lightning, heavy rain, and frequent power outages. Each time I fired up that generator, connected to one of my propane tanks, I was grateful I had stood my ground. The 4th of July community barbecue that Brenda had originally wanted my propane for went off without a hitch. The HOA had budgeted properly, purchased their own propane, and threw a great party with food, music, and fireworks. I attended with Marcus, and we laughed about how simple it had been for the HOA to just buy what they needed instead of trying to shake down residents. As the 1-year anniversary of Brenda's initial visit approached, I found myself thinking about the entire experience with a sense of perspective I hadn't had while living through it. The situation had tested me in ways I never expected, forcing me to stand up for myself, navigate complex legal systems, and deal with harassment and criminal activity. But it had also shown me the importance of community, the value of good neighbors like Marcus, and the strength I had inside myself when pushed to my limits. The Meadowbrook Estates HOA was thriving under new leadership. Property values were stable, residents were generally happy, and the petty tyranny that had characterized Brenda's brief tenure was a fading memory. The board had implemented new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse of power, including term limits for officers, and a requirement that all violation notices be reviewed by at least 2 board members before being sent. I continued my work as an electrical contractor, taking pride in my craftsmanship and building my business through referrals and repeat clients. My home remained my sanctuary, a place where I could relax after long days on job sites. The propane tanks, those 6 containers of compressed gas that had somehow become the focal point of a criminal case, sat quietly in their screened area, doing their job without fanfare or drama. In August, I heard that Brenda had been released on parole after serving 9 months. She moved to Tucson to live with a sister, far enough from Scottsdale that we were unlikely to ever cross paths again. I wished her well in rebuilding her life. People make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, and they deserve a chance at redemption if they're willing to do the work. The autumn brought cooler temperatures and a sense of renewal to the desert landscape. I joined the HOA board as a regular member, not an officer, wanting to contribute to the community without taking on too much responsibility. My experience with the legal system and understanding of the bylaws made me a valuable resource, and I enjoyed helping to resolve disputes and find reasonable solutions to problems. During one board meeting in October, a new resident complained about his neighbor's decorative rocks being the wrong color according to the landscaping guidelines. The old Brenda-led board might have issued a violation notice and started the fine process. Instead, we had a conversation about whether the rule really served the community's interests and whether selective enforcement was fair. We ended up modifying the landscaping guidelines to allow for more flexibility while still maintaining the neighborhood's overall aesthetic. It was a small thing, but it represented how much had changed. The HOA was becoming a helpful organization that facilitated community rather than a tyrannical body that existed to punish residents. People were getting along better, attending community events, and actually enjoying living in Meadowbrook Estates. As December arrived and the year drew to a close, I hosted another small Christmas dinner. This time, The guest list included not just Marcus, but several other neighbors I had gotten to know through my work with the HOA board. We ate, laughed, shared stories, and celebrated the sense of community we had built together. Standing on my back patio that evening, watching the sun set over the Arizona desert, and listening to the friendly conversation around my dining table, I felt genuinely content. The ordeal with Brenda seemed like ancient history, a strange and stressful chapter that had ultimately led to positive changes for everyone involved. My propane tanks sat in their screened area, fully compliant with all HOA regulations, ready to power my generator, grill, and heater whenever needed. They were just objects, pieces of metal containing fuel, but they had become symbols of something larger. The importance of standing your ground, the value of documentation and legal processes, and the consequences of letting power corrupt your judgment. Life moved on as it always does. The neighborhood continued to evolve, with families moving in and out, children growing up, and the shared spaces being used and enjoyed by residents. The community center hosted events, the common areas were maintained, and the HOA operated smoothly under fair and reasonable leadership. I never forgot the lessons I learned during those intense months of conflict and legal proceedings. I kept my security cameras maintained and functioning. I documented any official correspondence carefully. I stood up for myself and others when situations seemed unfair or unreasonable. But I also tried to approach conflicts with empathy and understanding, remembering that people are complex and that everyone deserves to be treated with basic dignity and respect. The story of the HOA Karen who demanded my propane and ended up in prison became something of a legend in Scottsdale HOA circles. I occasionally got calls from other homeowners facing similar harassment from their associations, asking for advice on how to handle the situation. I always told them the same thing. Document everything, know your rights, don't be afraid to stand up for yourself, and let the legal system work. Years passed, and the intensity of those events faded further into memory. I continued living in Meadowbrook Estates, watching the neighborhood mature and change. The propane tank screen I built that first week, the one that started all the trouble, weathered and aged like everything else in the harsh desert climate. I replaced some of the lattice panels eventually, keeping the structure maintained and functional. Every time I looked at that screen, or fired up my generator during a monsoon storm, or grilled steaks for friends on a warm evening, I remembered. I remembered the fear I felt when Brenda first threatened me, the anger when I discovered my property had been stolen, the satisfaction of seeing justice served, and ultimately, the peace that came from knowing I had done the right thing. The experience changed me in subtle but important ways. I became more involved in my community, more willing to speak up when I saw injustice, more confident in my ability to handle difficult situations. I also became more compassionate, understanding that even people who do terrible things are still human beings struggling with their own demons and challenges. Brenda Patterson's name faded from neighborhood conversations, replaced by discussions of more current events and concerns. New residents moved in who never knew about the scandal, who just saw a well-maintained neighborhood with an effective HOA board. That was probably for the best. Communities need to move forward, not dwell on past conflicts. As I sit here now, several years removed from those intense few months, I can honestly say I'm grateful for the experience, as strange as that might sound. It taught me strength I didn't know I had. It connected me with neighbors like Marcus who became true friends. It showed me the importance of standing up against bullies and corruption, even when it's scary and uncomfortable. My propane tanks are still here, still serving their purpose, still properly screened and maintained. They're not symbols anymore, just useful tools that make my life more comfortable and secure. But I'll never forget the lessons they inadvertently taught me about justice, community, and the importance of refusing to be pushed around. The sun sets over Scottsdale, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Another day ends in the Arizona desert, in a quiet neighborhood where people live their lives, maintain their homes, and generally get along with their neighbors. The drama of those few months in summer seems impossibly distant now, like something that happened to someone else in another lifetime. But it did happen, and it mattered, and the ripples from those events continue to shape how the Meadowbrook Estates HOA operates today. Fair enforcement, reasonable rules, respect for residents' rights. These principles didn't appear by accident. They emerged from conflict, from someone standing up and saying enough is enough, from a community deciding together what kind of place they wanted to live in. And it all started with 6 propane tanks, and a Karen who couldn't accept the word no.